Everyone, what is going on? What is going on? My name is Curtis Brooks. I'm a men's life coach who specializes in transformational leadership. I help men communicate their way to healthy relationships. In part two of our series, Are You Doing the Work on Leadership and Personal Growth? We'll be talking about anger. Anger is a huge part of us as men. As the Bible speaks of Moses not making it into the promised land, it is a huge part for us as men. Not making it into the promised land, or at least not being able to scale in growth, not accomplishing those personal and professional goals. Anger plays a major part for us as men. So we'll dive more into that, and we'll use the story in the Bible of Moses where he was not able to make it into the promised land as a parallel to anger. And it wasn't necessary just for anger what Moses was dealing with. Moses was dealing with disobedience, and the very thing that just did not allow him to make it into the promised land was his disobedience. So I would further title this conversation, The Fallout, Not Doing What You Know to Do. And here is Moses not doing what he knew to do. And what he knew to do was that he had heard from God. God told him to strike that rock, or in another occasion, he told him to speak to the rock. So first, he told him to strike the rock, and he did just that. And secondly, in another part of the Bible, God tells Moses to speak to the rock. Now, during this time, Moses and the rest of the rest of the Israelites, they are in a situation where they're famished. There's no water, and they're just going through. Their cattle is dying, and just a lot of different things going on. And even as leaders, maybe we've been faced with a situation, maybe not necessarily with the cattle dying, but we've been faced with a situation such as Moses, where we are in a trying situation and there are things that we know to do, but we don't do them because of the pressure. And so here Moses was under a huge amount of pressure as it relates to the situation, the circumstances that he was in. He's leading millions upon millions of people, Israelites, his own people, to a place, to eventually a promised land, as they are actually at some point they are wandering around the desert trying to figure out what they need to do. And most of what they were found wandering about, or at least where they're stemming from, was their disobedience. And let's just face it, as leaders, guys, sometimes, again, knowing what to do, there's a fallout of knowing what to do and just not doing it. So there are absolutely going to be consequences. So this is exactly what Moses dealt with. He dealt with the consequences. And unfortunately, because he allowed the people to really de-emphasize or uh, not bring a holiness to God because of the pressure that he was under. And yet Moses, in the midst of all of this going on, the people not having water, hearing of the stories from one person to another person, one family to another family, their cattle were dying, and they were just losing all kinds of things that were just personal and important to them. And so here's Moses again, just under the pressure, such as we are as leaders, husbands and fathers, under a pressure, because we've got our kids who've got needs, we have our wives, our significant others who have needs, and yet our employees have needs as leaders of different organizations. And we're now facing a situation where there are things that we know to do from our own experience now. There are things that we have learned and that we know that if I do this, it's going to make them unhappy, but yet if I do this, if I don't do this, I know the consequences. And let's face it, we don't always know the consequences 1000%. And so here's where Moses comes in. Now, he's angry. He's angry because of the pressure, much like us as people, as leaders, as fathers, as husbands. We are dealing with a insurmountable amount of anger. And because of this anger that Moses was dealing with, when God asked Moses, or told Moses to speak to the rock, rather than speak to the rock, Moses struck the rock with his staff. And that's not what God told him to do. God told Moses to speak to the rock. So Moses, in his anger, he smacked the rock with his staff, and yet God, through his kindness and his promise, he allowed water to come out. But yet God said, and it's not what God said, but I just want to add this piece, is that God was not going to be shown up, if you will. His promises would remain. So the water came out of the rock, even though Moses had hit the rock with his staff, and he was God, and God had told Moses to speak to the rock. So how does anger affect our day-to-day life? Anger is one of those things where when we're not dealing with it, so first, anger has to come from two places. It's either coming from our past or it's something that we're dealing with the present moment. And in most cases, anger comes from our past. It comes from something that we have not dealt with, or something that we could have done differently, or again, a host of different things. But there it lies in our past, showing up in a very present moment as if it was that situation happened yesterday for some of us. And though that situation can absolutely be years behind us, anger has a way of having us feel like we're bound by something or held captive. And that's exactly what anger does. Anger can make us feel like we're being captivated by something that is out of our control. And in most cases, it is very much so in our control, but because we fail to deal with XYZ, and again, anger could be how we've been treated. Anger could be, again, coming from a host of different reasons why we may be angry. But by and large, it's something that, or matter that has not been dealt with. And because it has not been dealt with, it shows up in the very present moment, our future, if you will. And we can say, well, Curtis, how do you know it shows up in our future? Because our future is the present moment, especially if that anger or that situation has been years behind us, perhaps a breakup or perhaps a relationship ended uh, in a in a on the wrong note or something like that. Something was said to you, you're made fun of, and just didn't like how people talked about you. Again, a host of different things of why anger shows up. But by and large, there are reasons why we have not dealt with that thing. I was recently talking with my wife, not necessarily in a situation with anger, but on how at times when we feel compelled not to apologize about a situation. And I too have been there, and perhaps you've been there as well, at times when we are either felt like someone has done something wrong to us, or we've done something wrong to someone, or someone didn't like something. And let's go with this piece here, where we've done something wrong to someone, or the person was unhappy about something, and we knew that we needed to apologize. We sat with that situation or that thing for a moment, and we knew that we needed to apologize. But it was something that compelled us not to apologize. It was a resistance, something that was pulling us to say, no, I'm not going to apologize. But yet there's something that was edging us or just provoking us to say, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that, or I shouldn't have said that. And this is what I was telling her or sharing with my wife, is that there's a resistance. When that resistance comes up, we know that it's not from God, because only the thought of the enemy or the devil would show up and apply resistance for the very thing that we know to do, but we don't do it. Such as the situation with Moses. He had been given clear instructions on how to access this water from the rock. He was supposed to speak to the rock, but instead he hit the rock with his staff. Now, in the previous scriptures, Moses was told to hit the rock with his staff, and that he did. But now in this situation, God asked Moses to speak to the rock. But because Moses tapped the rock or hit the rock out of anger, angry from the people, just with their many demands, and that's what we face oftentimes as leaders, as husbands, as fathers. We face a huge demand from our subordinates, from our family members, and all those who we may be in charge of. We face the pressure of promoting the organization in a way that what the organization's mission is. But sometimes, due to inherent problems that need to be solved, and we as leaders have not taken a stand on certain situations, or we are, as leaders, haven't dealt with our own stuff. And here Moses was dealing with disobedience because God gave him clear cut instructions on how to deal with the situation they were in. They were in need of water. Water is a resource that we all can't live without. And here Moses is dealing with millions of people who he's trying to lead to the promised land. And perhaps, as I stated earlier, maybe you're not leading millions upon millions of people to the promised land, or there's not a need for water to feed cattle and the people and things of that nature for bathing purposes and things of that. Maybe that's not your situation. But due to the anger that as we deal with as leaders, husbands, and fathers, it's preventing us from being the leaders in our household. It's preventing us from making sound decisions because there's something that we're dealing with or have not dealt with. And again, maybe that situation is behind us, years and years behind us. And now it shows up in the very present moment, still trying to affect the very life that we're trying to live right now, showing up in our future. Because if you haven't dealt with it, if we haven't dealt with it as leaders, fathers, and husbands, it has a tendency to show up day after day after day after day. And personally, I was looking at this anger, this monster, not too long ago, and having a conversation, my personal time, private time with God, having a conversation, and knowing how anger shows up day after day after day, especially or it has a propensity to show up day after day after day, especially if we have not dealt with the very thing that has been behind us. And we have a tendency to find ourselves, uh, not literally, but figuratively, toting that thing around like baggage or a badge of honor or something like that. Toting that thing around. And yet, at the same time, we can feel like that thing or that anger, that thing that angers us, or perhaps there's a situation as a leader, you're dealing with other leaders, management, perhaps difference of personalities. As a husband, you're dealing with something your wife said or that you didn't like, something that she said that perhaps triggered you. As a father, the children are off the chain and just doing something just they know not to do, but they did it. And these things naturally, as fathers, as husbands, as leaders, they can anger us. But I thought about anger this way. As God has been a loving God to me and to you, all of those who are desiring God in your life, desiring that transformation leadership, that leadership that transcends our own understanding. And I'm not talking about the textbook knowledge or information that we get from the years and years of studying different leadership styles. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a leadership that transforms or transcends that low-hanging fruit. And that's what I'm going to call that kind of leadership is the low-hanging fruit, because ultimately I think it ends up being a lot of manipulation. We're having to put people through. And until we as leaders husbands and fathers deal with the very things that we are failing to deal with. Anger continues to bind us up. Anger continues to keep us being held captive, in captivity by anger, and not able to access the fruit of our own labor. And let's face it, as men, as leaders, husbands and fathers, we're not always angry, and there are a lot of good things that we've done. But anger has a way of really kind of marking those things and making those things, those different things that we've done, the good things that we've done, it has a way of making those things appear to be insignificant and that there are no value to those things. And as we are standing on that benchmark and say, well, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. People don't see that. People see the anger. Because let's face it, anger has a way of really, again, taking away from the very good that we've done. Anger has a way of, when we dealing with our children, it has a way of making us look like a dictator, where our children can be afraid of us. Dealing with our wives, it can make our wives feel like they're afraid of us, and we're that they're walking on eggshells, in particular to different conversations, or not being able to express themselves or have the freedom to express themselves. And I look at it this way: as a Christian, as a believer, for me, God didn't draw me with anger. It wasn't anger that drew me. It wasn't listening to a message from a pastor or someone who perhaps was witnessing to me. It wasn't their anger that drew me. It was the love and kindness that they had shared with me. Because through their relationship with Christ, there was a love and kindness, there was an expectation that they had shared with me, something that they had received from God Himself. And through their obedience, they delivered a message that was appealing to me. That wasn't angry, because I guarantee you, if the message had been delivered out of anger, there would not have been the acceptance. I would not have received that message. Like most of us, as leaders and husbands and fathers, it can be difficult receiving a message that was intended to be out of love, but yet delivered in a way of a person being angry. Because let's face it, when we are angry, it sends so many questions to those who are on the receiving end of our conversation. Like, what's wrong with him? Why is he acting this way? Uh, what happened? Who took a, you know, who who took this man and placed this person as a leader? Whose decision was it to place him in a position as a leader? So many questions that individuals or as employees might have being on the receiving end. So many questions that our children might have being on the receiving end. So many questions that our wives might have being on the receiving end of our anger. So guys, when our anger is not dealt with, and I don't mean to beat this anger with a, as a dead horse, but it is important for us as men to know, as leaders, husbands, and fathers, that anger is something that we need to decide that we're going to set ourselves free from. And as we are making that decision to set ourselves free, to recognize that, hey, that thing which has been plaguing me, plaguing us as men, that was done, either months, years ago. Perhaps it's something that's fresh. And I'm not saying get over it. That's not my point. The point is to recognize the anger. And that when we don't recognize it, it's like a virus, if you will. It gets bigger and bigger, something that's multiplying to the point where it consumes us, to the point where we can find ourselves being on edge. But when you can recognize the anger and realize that, wait a minute, this anger has had me bound to the point where I am not able to be myself. Now, because the anger has had us bound for so long, it's now, in most cases, like having to rediscover ourselves as leaders, as fathers, as husbands. It's like getting to know that person who, for all intents and purposes, who learns how to become at peace with himself. So, guys, I'm going to wrap it up right there. I'm going to say thank you for listening. I'm going to say this has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. We've been talking about anger as part 2 of our series, Are You Doing the Work for Leadership and Development? Once again, my name is Curtis Brooks. I am a men's life coach and helping men to communicate their way to healthy relationships. We'll talk with you again for our next series, or part 3 in our series, Are You Doing the Work on Leadership and Personal Development? Ciao for now. We'll talk with you soon. Bye-bye.